Okay. Yes. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the penultimate day of the Humanities College Summer School of Literary Theory and Philosophy 2021, which is a joint initiative between University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and St. Bergman's College, Kerala. Today we have Professor Christopher Norris with us. It is difficult to introduce such a great philosopher, critic, and writer in just a few minutes, but it is my responsibility how to introduce him to the audience in a proper manner. So, Chris is a world-renowned expert on deconstruction and the works of Derrida. He has published numerous works and research papers in literary theory, modern continental philosophy, philosophy of music, philosophy of language, and philosophy of science. And his current main interest is in the relationship between philosophy and poetry, including the idea of verse as a way of addressing philosophical themes. So I had the opportunity to participate in Chris's Philosophy Cafe, and I'm confident that his influence on me shaped my thinking and writing significantly. So, Chris, thank you very much for this opportunity, and now it's over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about music theory and about the intersection or the points of overlap between literary theory and music theory. It's a topic that, in a way, goes a long way back. It goes back through the history of philosophy to Plato and the Greeks, and various philosophers have written about philosophy, and they've had theories about it, and they've responded to music, sometimes in a positive, affirmative, enthusiastic way, sometimes less so, sometimes with a certain mistrust, a certain awkwardness, if you like, or suspicion of music and what it does to us through our musical responses. Plato is the first example of that. Plato felt the power of music just as he felt the power of poetry. But in both cases, poetry and music, he suspected the power of poetry or music, of the arts in general, to move us excessively, to conjure excessive feelings of enthusiasm, of joy, the power that music especially has of overwhelming our rational faculties, if you like, sweeping us away, conjuring up this tremendously fervent and powerful passional response. So Plato is very guarded, very cautious and cautionary, I suppose you might say, in his responses to music. His compromise is to say, well, certain kinds of music, certain modes, the modes are different scales, if you like. If you think of a piano keyboard, or I should apologize to begin with, actually, that I'm going to talk mainly about Western music, Western instruments, Western musical forms, and to a large extent Western philosophers. And this will seem very parochial, but I'm ashamed to say, although I enjoy Indian music and have listened to a fair amount of Indian music, I'm not sufficiently well informed and certainly not sufficiently expert to say anything very interesting or original about it. So I hope you'll forgive me if my references are rather narrowly confined to the Western canon, the Western body of music. And I hope that to a large extent what I say will apply to other kinds of music, other musical traditions and cultures, which may differ in all sorts of ways. So in Plato, you find the idea that certain modes, and a mode is a set of notes which go together in the form of a scale. So in Western music, the dominant modes are major and minor, and the major mode generally sounds rather more cheerful, rather more brisk and affirmative, if you like. The minor mode sounds generally slightly more melancholy, less high-spirited. There are exceptions to that, but Plato thought some modes, music in some modes, was okay. It was stirring, it was martial, it tended to lift the spirits, it gave soldiers courage in war, it filled the people, the listeners, with positive feelings and sentiments. Other modes he felt were, well, he used the word effeminate. which is a very sexist way of putting it, but it's the idea that by pushing certain intervals down, by making semitones in place of tones, by changing the relationship between notes, you can induce, or music can induce, different kinds of responses. And he thought certain responses were okay, but other responses were to be discouraged because they could encourage the wrong response, because they could undermine certain civic virtues, if you like, bravery, courage, directness, straightforwardness. Kant was the same. Kant wasn't very musical. So far as we can see, Immanuel Kant, although he talks occasionally about music, didn't respond very directly or very strongly to music. And the reason for that, I think, is that Kant was a great system builder. Kant was at home with concepts, if you like, with conceptual arguments, with relatively abstract, high-level explanation and aesthetic judgment and a whole range of things. But he was happiest when he was able to articulate a clear conceptual argument and develop his ideas in a rigorous and consistent way. Music, I think, rather baffled him. Music was he could tell, he knew in a way that music induced these powerful responses, but they were beyond his explanation, and he felt uncomfortable and suspicious in the presence of music. Music, in technical Kantian terms, was an intensive manifold. It was a great mass of sensory impressions which weren't clearly distinct one from another. He was happier with extensive manifolds, which can be categorized and conceptualized and differentiated one from another. After Kant, you have a philosopher, one of the first Western philosophers to take a genuine, deep and widely read interest in Eastern philosophy, who gave music a central place in his philosophical thinking. Music for him was, in a way, the ultimate reality. He said the other arts, the arts of sculpture and painting and architecture and even poetry, existed at one remove from this ultimate human reality. He called that reality the will, by which he didn't mean anything like what most philosophers mean by the will. He meant a kind of ceaseless striving, a kind of constant yearning, a constant reaching forward, a constant dissatisfaction. He often spoke of it in very negative terms, all the way from bodily, autonomic functions, for instance, like the heartbeat, sexual drive, and everything that's instinctive, everything that is sub or irrational. But Schopenhauer, in a way, contradicts himself. He says music is the only art that puts us directly in touch with the will. It doesn't go through mediations, images, metaphors, abstract concepts. It doesn't place us at one remove from the will. It plunges us directly into the will. So he had a very romantic conception of music. And the contradiction is that, on the one hand, he says, we should, where possible, escape from the will. Perhaps, he says, aesthetic contemplation, the contemplation of artworks, might afford us a kind of momentary release from the ceaseless impetus of the will. And yet, at the same time, he says music is the will. It doesn't simply represent the will. His big book is called The World as Will and Representation. So he's caught in this contradiction. Like many great philosophers, if you look hard enough, you'll find some deep, central, underlying contradiction that is both, in a way, you know, it's worrying, it's perplexing to think they can be drawn into contradiction that way. On the other hand, it is the springboard, the mainspring of their philosophy. So in Schopenhauer, music is hugely important, but at the same time, it occupies that very ambiguous zone. Nietzsche comes after Schopenhauer. For Nietzsche, music was, you might say, the most important thing in the world in some ways. He responded very keenly to music, and he judged cultures and civilizations according to their music. He wrote a lot about ancient Greek culture, and he saw ancient Greek culture as being torn between what he called the Apollinian and the Dionysian drives or instincts. The Dionysian is frenzy, drunkenness, wild celebration, everything that's over the top and crazy. The Apollinian is the rational, form-giving, restraining impulse. So you can see the history of philosophy exists in a very close but very fraught and ambivalent relationship to music. Music fascinates philosophers, but at the same time, it stands apart from philosophical thought. Now, what's happened more recently, that was just a kind of sketch history of what some philosophers have had to say about music. Philosophers still write a lot about music, aesthetic philosophers whose special interest is music. But more recently, literary theorists have taken an interest in music. Hence my choice of this topic for this lecture. Literary theorists of various schools, from the American New Critics to the early structuralists in the mid to late 1960s in France, deconstructionists, post-structuralists, Lacanian psychoanalysts have had a lot to say about music, and they've shifted the terms of discourse. They've shifted the discussion of music toward linguistics, or at least toward the analogy with language. The background feeling, if you like, the general intuition they have, is that music is a language, or there is something linguistic about music. They're not talking about music with words. They're not talking about music that has a text or a libretto, or they're not talking about songs, for instance. But there's a much more systematic idea in the background, a much more general idea. And that is that music, like language, has a kind of syntax, a way of connecting words in grammatical or intelligible form. Music, like language, has a semantics. We feel that it has meaning. Very often it's difficult to say just what the meaning of music is. And it's notoriously controversial. As soon as you advance a program for a piece of music, as soon as you try to explain, for instance, which parts of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony illustrate which aspects of the countryside, you know, bubbling brooks, for instance, or storms, or the advent of spring. Or, you immediately get into very subjective territory. It's really a matter of individual listener response. And so there are huge disagreements as to just what kind of meaning is involved here. But most listeners to music do feel that music has a meaning, but they're very hard put. They're very challenged and perplexed to say just what that meaning is. One answer is the answer that the composer Mendelssohn gave. Someone said to him, music is too vague to express anything specific. And Mendelssohn said, he turned it around, that challenge, and he said, on the contrary, music is itself too specific, too precise and well-defined in the feelings it expresses for words to come close to expressing it. In other words, music was much more clear and unambiguous. That's not to say it couldn't express ambiguous feelings, but it would express those ambiguous feelings clearly. The ambiguity would be there in the notes. So Mendelssohn, the composer, thought that it did make sense to talk of meaning in music, and that music was a language of the emotions, and that it defined those emotions, those feelings, more precisely than any other form of expression. This gives rise to one of the main debates in music theory nowadays. That is the debate between formalism and expressivism. I talk about these things in the handouts, so if they interest you, you might want to have a look at the handouts. I go into more detail. Formalism is basically the idea that, and you find this across all the arts. You find it in the visual arts, and you find it in literary criticism and in music criticism. It's the idea that art exists to make good use, to make good, inventive, original use of forms, to devise new forms. The Russian formalists in literary theory, who were very active in the 1920s, 20s and early 30s, raised this into a doctrine. It's the idea that a piece of fiction, let's say, or a piece of poetry is only really worth doing. It only has artistic merit if it does something original, something innovative in a formal sense. If it discovers a new narrative technique or a new point of view for narration, or a new poetic form, perhaps a new particular combination of rhyme scheme and meter. But there has to be some formal justification for producing a work of art. You may, of course, just produce things in the old mold, in the old way of doing things, but to have any kind of real merit and significance, there has to be a formal innovation. And a lot of the writing about music in the 20th and early 21st century has taken that pretty much for granted. In the writings, for instance, of Theodor Adorno, the German music theorist, Frankfurt theorist, it is more or less assumed that any music that falls back into established patterns, any music that lapses into familiar or often repeated chord sequences, for instance, or melodic patterns, is going to be second or third rate. It's going to prop up an old-fashioned and regressive mode of thinking about music. So Adorno takes it pretty much for granted that music will break new ground. It will explore further than previous music. There's a kind of dynamic, or he would say a dialectic relation between music and history that places a value, a premium on formal innovation. So that's formalist doctrine in a nutshell. Expressivism says that the main function of music is not formal innovation, not form in any usual sense of the word, but expression, power or intensity or subtlety or refinement or beauty of expression. And there are various ways of expressing that doctrine, various priorities you can have. But the idea there is that music is the communication of emotion. And again, if you look at criticism of other art forms, you find the same disagreements in literary theory about poetry. In the early 20th century, there was a great debate between those who thought that analysis, formal analysis, was the most important thing. So poetry had to be challenging. It had to be tough-minded, if you like. It had to resist any easy or familiarizing reading. And it was good to analyze poetry because it helped us to understand the sources of our own pleasure, our own satisfaction in reading poetry. So it's premised on the idea that understanding things better, understanding them more deeply or in more detail, is a good thing. On the other hand, you had a reaction against that. Roughly speaking, it works out as a debate between Cambridge and Oxford. Cambridge literary critics and poets tended to be more cerebral, more intellectual, and more demanding of analysis, if you like, than Oxford people. It's digging down, killing the plant, you know, from a gardening analogy. So you had this very clear distinction between, on the one hand, appreciated, tough, highly articulate and cerebral poetry, intellectual poetry. On the other, you had the appreciators, those who thought that the most important thing was to appreciate and to relish the kinds of the beauty, if you like, of a poem and the intensity and the power of the emotions it expressed. So a very clear divide there. And you find in the century is the critic Charles Rosen. And I'll give you some idea of what Rosen says, but if you want to follow this up, and I recommend it because he's a wonderful writer on music, his book, The Classical Style, and by classical here he means basically the music written around the end of the 18th and the early 19th century, second half of the 18th, or no, the last quarter of the 18th, really. In other words, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and a few composers just before and a few just after. That's classical in the period-specific sense. And Rosen is a man of huge learning, very wide reading, who's also a pianist, a very good concert pianist. I interviewed him once many years ago, and he had some interesting things to say. But he writes about literature. He writes in the New York Review of Books, and he is something that's very rare nowadays, at least in scholarly circles. That is not an all-rounder exactly, but he knows a lot about a lot of different things, and he sees interesting connections between them. And one of the striking things about Rosen's criticism is that he's clearly read literary critics. He's read the new critics. He's read William Empson to great effect. He has read quite a lot of the new French theory. He's kept up with it because he reads and writes about French literature too. And his book, The Classical Style, makes constant reference, either explicitly or by allusion, to literary criticism, historical literary criticism and theoretical literary criticism, and especially to close reading in the modern style. He writes a lot about Empson, and even where he's not writing about Empson, he is drawing tacitly, drawing on Empson's ideas. So he's constantly talking about musical ambiguity, about ambiguity of key, for instance, the way that music can slip between major and minor, or sometimes can exploit all kinds of bitonal or polytonal key interchanges, so as to create a very rich but confused, if you like, impression of mixed feelings. He's constantly very aware of the ambiguity of music and of the resonances, the cultural resonances. And he brings together these two, there's more than interests, I mean, these two areas of exceptional responsiveness and expertise, by being a very good writer, by being an exceptionally gifted writer about music. Now, Rosen, in many ways, bears comparison with the American New Criticism. In some ways, he's close to Empson, I suppose. He has the kind of freedom and creative and productive looseness of Empson's writing. But he values the same things that the American literary critics of the New Criticism do. It's ambiguity, he values paradox, he values complexity. One of the background assumptions of a lot of music, because complexity challenges our habitual modes of response. It takes us beyond what is familiar and what is easy, what comes naturally to us, if you like. So it raises a challenge to established forms of response. And which now goes back more than 4 decades, but it's the idea that you need a certain amount of redundancy in a message in order for a message to get through clearly, whether it be a coded message or a digital message, or for that matter, a musical or literary language. You need a certain amount of redundancy, because otherwise the information overload would be too great. You couldn't, let's say, take the music in. You couldn't respond to it adequately because you would be swamped, overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information. And by information here, I mean in a general sense, musical meaning. So a certain amount of redundancy, but at the same time, it's good for those background norms to be challenged. Some of the best writing on in the classical style, in Rosen's book, The Classical Style, has to do with the way that music negotiates this very delicate path between letting us know what we ought to expect on the one hand. You have to recognize the style of the music you're listening to, and that means you can, to some extent, predict what's going to come next. You know, there must be a degree of predictability, but at the same time, there must be something to challenge and resist and complicate that predictability. So one theory that, well, I'm quite drawn to it, I think it's a good starting point, at least for a theory of music, is that music can be regarded as a kind of information, and that there is a certain, if you like, point of balance between the redundancy, between what's necessary in order to acclimatize or to familiarize us with the music. So if you're listening to a piece of Mozart, you know something about Mozart's style, you know something about the period style. The period style will be a very predictable, general sort of thing. The Mozart style will be a specific set of options within that period style, which to some extent are familiar to you, and yet not altogether, because Mozart will often do things that are unpredictable, that are striking, or, well, we use the word original. In other words, there's something about his musical sensibility that does unexpected things. It's a bit like Aristotle saying that in a tragedy, people have to be inconsistently consistent or consistently inconsistent. There has to be that interplay of what you can predict and what you can't predict. So this is the background idea that complexity is, on the whole, a good thing. There may be some composers are so complex and so unexpected and so unpredictable. I can think of avant-garde composers who fall into that category, that it's hard to hear their music as music. You hear it as noise because the level of information is so high and the level of redundancy is so low that it's very difficult to process it as music. Okay, so this is one phase of criticism of literary theory where there are clear analogies with of music theory, where there are clear analogies with literary theory. And very roughly speaking, the analogy is between, on the one hand, Empson, the American New Criticism, which was a criticism of irony, paradox, ambiguity, and other terms like plurisignification, which means multiple meaning. But it was a kind of formalism. It took for granted that poems or musical works have forms, and those forms will bear examining, analyzing, unpacking, and interpreting. Then in the 1960s, you have a new wave of music criticism inspired by literary theory, influenced by French structuralism. Now I can remember perhaps not the early days of, well, the early days of structuralism, as you know, go back to Saussurean linguistics in the early 20th century. But for a long time, structuralism was largely confined to linguistics. It was a theoretical program in synchronic linguistics devised for very specialist purposes of linguistic description. But then after Saussure gave his lectures in Geneva in the early 20th century, they had an influence on linguistics, but a limited influence, and didn't spread far beyond that. Then from the 1950s on, you get this tremendous upsurge of interest, this sort of efflorescence of interest around the rediscovery of Saussure. And the basic terms of structuralist linguistics, long and parole, signifier and signified, the synchronic and the diachronic, all of them binary distinctions. And of course, structuralism is all about binary distinctions. It's kind of proto-digital approach to language. All of a sudden, these distinctions were discovered by a whole new generation, not only of linguists, structural linguists, but of anthropologists and literary theorists, narrative theorists and poeticians, students of poetics, people in the human sciences, in history, in classical studies, in psychoanalysis. So there's some tremendous uptake of Saussure's ideas. And music theory was one of the fields where this happened. A series of books that came out, some of them in English translation, not all, in the 1960s and early 70s, which adapted structuralist terminology and terms of reference to musical analytic purposes. So the assumption was that there is a language of music, and the best way to place works within that language to understand their relationship to this wider language of music was to examine structural relations within the work, okay? And that might take the form of analyzing tonal structures, key shifts within, say, a symphony or a string quartet. It might take the form of analyzing scores, the graphic notation of music, or it might take a more phenomenological approach, our responses, our subjective listener responses to music. But the motivating idea behind it was that criticism had to be made more methodical rather, had to be made more rigorous. It had to have a vocabulary of clearly defined technical terms. It had to analyze the structural relations within a work of music, and it had to analyze the relationship between those structural relations and the wider discourse or the wider language of music. So you find as well as linguistics and music studies, you find that anthropologists like Levi-Strauss, perhaps the outstanding example of a really ambitious, large-scale structuralist theorist, Levi-Strauss saying, you know, anthropology as we have it is just too diverse, too muddled, too huge, too ill-defined a field of study. You know, you can study, if you're an anthropologist, there's nothing in human life that you can't study, because all human life is your field of examination. So Levi-Strauss says what we need is method. And where do we get our method? From Saussure. We can take Saussure's idea of individual speech acts of parole, as coming out of and relying on the resources of la langue, language as a whole. And we can analogize, we can compare that to the way that individual myths, stories, folk practices, customs, marriage rituals, all these things, all these cultural phenomena, draw upon an underlying set of relationships, one thing as against another. So nature as against culture, which would be the archetypal opposition. So that's the structuralist gesture, if you like. That's the founding gesture of structuralist thinking. It's this idea of an underlying set of codes and relationships that can be used. They can be spelled out, you know, in a fairly straightforward way in structural fashion, and they can then be used to interpret a vast, a potentially infinite range of cultural practices. So this was, you know, I can remember the tail end of structuralism, you know, when it began to make the transition into post-structuralism and deconstruction. The enormous excitement there was invested in this this project, because it seemed to promise at last to place the humanities, the human sciences, if you like, on a rigorous basis, and thus to challenge the sciences. You know, the sciences we think of as progressive and making discoveries, and as being rigorous and having a clear grasp of their own conceptual procedures. But structuralism had that kind of scientific promise. The problem with it was that in many ways it tended to state the obvious in different terms, because music analysts had for quite a long time had some very sophisticated models of music, beginning in Germany in the 19th century. There were a series of music theorists. The most important of them was a man called Heinrich Schenker, S-C-H-E-N-K-E-R, who is very unfashionable nowadays for various reasons I'll explain. But Schenker wrote a lot about the Austro-German tradition of symphonic and chamber music. And he thought that the greatest thing about, well, what made a work of music great was that it was unified. Okay, so you might listen to a Beethoven symphony or a Brahms string quartet, and you'd hear lots of different themes, and you'd hear key shifts, and you'd hear passages that contrasted strongly with each other, different speed, different tempi. You'd hear what sounded like a whole range of very different musical events happening. But Schenker said, in every really good piece of music, every really great piece of music, there is a unity, there's a developmental unity. The piece grows in an almost organic way. And this metaphor of organicism is one that really took hold in music criticism, as it did in literary criticism. So this all goes back to the 19th century. And this kind of analysis grows up alongside the development of music, classical music, in the Austro-German tradition. Schenker devotes most of his essays in musical analysis to the work of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms and Schumann, that great sort of central line of Austro-German composers. And his method of analysis is very closely tied to their music, because their music lends itself ideally to that kind of treatment. This doesn't mean that they were consciously writing in organic forms, or that, you know, that sonata form or any of the other dominant forms of that music were products of conscious will. But whether by instinct or by planning, they produced works which had exactly that quality, that characteristic. It's the idea of unity and multiplicity. philosophers have often, especially Neoplatonic philosophers, have often written a lot about multiplicity in unity. It's the idea that a great work of art, a poem or a piece of music, is going to display great variety within itself. There's going to be lots of different things going on within it, structural contrasts, but there will be a kind of overall shaping unity that holds them all together. And that became a central, almost item of faith, if you like, for Schenker and for many music analysts, and for literary critics like Coleridge, slightly earlier. Very often there's a time lag there between literary theorists having these ideas and music theorists picking them up and developing them in their own way. So the idea is that any work of music that's really worth looking at hard, listening to carefully and writing about at length is going to display that kind of internal complexity. It goes back to that point I made about information theory. That would be a modern way of making the same point. So the trouble with the structuralist musicology of the 1960s and early 70s, well, it went on a bit longer than that actually, but is that it basically found a new way of saying those old things. It was still talking about structural relations. It was still talking about developmental structures within the work. It was still assuming an idea of organic form and overall relationship between parts. But it simply found a new vocabulary to do it, a vocabulary that included Saussurean terms like signifier, signified, synchronic, diachronic, long parole, which gave it a kind of technical appeal. It appealed to those who wanted the human sciences to become more like the sciences, the natural physical sciences. But it didn't very much move things along. The next major development was more interesting. At the time, it came across as much more progressive and avant-garde. And that was a kind of liaison, a kind of meeting of minds between post-structuralism on the literary side and the new music, what came to be known as the new musicology. I can remember this. I can remember buying the journals and the books as they came out. You found constant cross-reference between, for instance, the work of Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes, who is a great, he deserves the name great, I think, a great writer as well as a great cultural theorist and literary critic. Immensely gifted, inventive, and highly original. But Barthes, for instance, in his book SZ, which is a fantastically close and inventive reading of a short novel by Balzac. I can't summarize SZ for you now. The title is S/Z, capital S/ slash rather Z. And the title fits very ingeniously with his reading of the story. But it's a piece of creative criticism, if you like, one of the earliest pieces of really brilliant creative criticism. And in that book, he draws constant musical analogies, mostly with the avant-garde French music of his own time. There was a kind of, not a mutual admiration club, but there was a very close sort of fellow feeling between avant-garde musicians at the time, people like Pierre Boulez, for instance, who was a conductor and a composer, who wrote some very advanced music, very avant-garde music, much of it inspired by French symbolist poetry, actually, of Mallarmé. And Boulez refers to Roland Barthes, and Barthes refers to Boulez, and it's not just kind of mutual back-scratching, but their theoretical ideas at the time were traveling along similar texts, because both of them were deeply critical of the idea of organic form. Barthes, in his reading of Balzac, for instance, says that that Balzac's texts are traditionally regarded as examples of well-made fictional form. People don't notice, he says, the strangeness of them, the odd details, the weird, paradoxical, disturbing details. And his reading of this Balzac novella, Sarrazin, is a reading on the lookout. It's on the alert for these challenging details that don't seem to have a place in the story, that have no place in the traditional idea of the well-made novel or the well-made narrative fiction. And at the same time, Boulez is questioning, well, he's questioning the whole legacy of Western music. He famously made lots of provocative statements, like he wanted to blow up all the opera houses in Europe and so forth. But they were the sort of the show-offy statements. But in his theorizing at the time, in books like Relève d'Apprenti, which is a collection of essays he brought out in the mid-70s, he's constantly looking across at literary theory, and the literary theorists are looking at least Barth was. But Barth was a very, very musical man. He was a brilliant pianist and wrote some wonderful essays on, especially on Schumann. He had a very deep feeling for kinship with almost Schumann. So what's happening here is that music critics are taking a lead from some of the more advanced and adventurous speculative literary theory of the time. In particular, Barth's idea of the limit text. This is what he says about the Balzac novella. He says, what you have in this novel is what looks like a piece of classical fiction with something odd about it, because it's about a deeply scandalous episode in French musical life. I haven't got time for the plot summary, but you can get the book. It's beautifully translated into English if you want it, Richard Howard's translation. But he says that basically most criticism of Balzac treats him as a producer of these well-finished, nicely turned, expertly constructed 19th century novels. In fact, Barth says, Balzac's texts are full of details which, if you allow them to sort of snag your mind, if you read them with a mind open to being sort of challenged and provoked, then you will see that he's not at all the good, well-behaved classical fiction maker that the critics would have him to be. And Boulez is doing the same thing to musical history. You know, he is taking apart, or at least he's very overtly challenging our expectations of the way music should go, the way it should be structured or constructed. So this was what you might call the period when post-structuralism, in that Roland Barthes, or that Barthesian form, dominated the field of avant-garde poetics. What happened after that was the rise of something which came to be known as deconstructive musicology. This was achieved dominance mainly in the US, among US musicologists. And basically it was a further working out of the case against organic form and against the kind of analysis that went along with the idea of organic form. So the new musicologists learned a lot from deconstruction, from Derrida in particular, and Paul de Man. I'll talk a bit more about Paul de Man in a moment, through his influence on this new musicology. And they challenged the idea of the integrated, well-made, perfectly formed work of music. There are a series of debates around this, and I'll summarize a couple of them because they'll give you some idea of what was going on. Two American aestheticians, you wouldn't call these new musicologists, they were more traditional aesthetic philosophers, but they happened to disagree on some of these basic issues that the new musicologists took up. Their names were Peter Kivy. That's this is all in the handouts if you've time to look at them. Peter Kivy, K-I-V-Y, and the other guy's called Levinson, Gerald Levinson, L-E-V-I-N-S-O-N. And they had a dispute about what it is to listen to music, a really very basic dispute, which raised some crucial issues. Levinson wrote an essay called Music in the Moment, Music in the Moment. And that title more or less summarizes what he says. He says, the analysts, the people who analyze symphonies and string quartets, make superhuman demands of the listener. They assume that when we listen to, let's say, a Beethoven symphony, we have very detailed memories of everything that's happened up to a certain point, up to the point we've reached in listening to it, you know, let's say halfway through the third movement. And analysis presupposes that we can hear a whole work, that we can remember a whole work, you know. And if you reach a certain point, but you've heard the work before, so you've heard Beethoven's Fifth, let's say, 20 times, and then you listen for the 21st time, and you get halfway through the third movement, and you will also know, according to this idealistic picture of it, what's going to happen, because you'll have heard the last movement, you'll have heard it right through to the last bar. And so as you hear each bit, it'll be informed by, it will be predisposed towards certain reactions by your knowledge of the whole piece, okay? And Levinson's right in a sense, you know, if you read Schenker, you know, he's clearly spent hundreds of hours listening to the pieces he analyzes, but he sort of expects his readers to have the whole piece in mind in the same way that he does. You know, he assumes, as many literary critics assume, a kind of super reader. You know, if you read a really detailed analytic narrative analysis of Middlemarch or of any novel, then the critic, who's clearly an expert because they've had the time and the leisure and the academic incentive to read the novel over and over with great attention to detail, they will be assuming a reader who has reached the same kind of level. But of course, that doesn't apply to most readers. They don't have time or leisure or desire to do that. So Levinson's point is that we listen in the moment, in the sense that we may have a kind of residual memory of what happened a few seconds ago, or conceivably a minute ago, okay? And we may conceivably have some sense of what's going to happen in perhaps the next 10 seconds. But beyond that, our musical imagination and memory doesn't go. So Levinson is saying critics are going to have to lower their sights, or they're going to have to make less strenuous and implausible demands of their readers, because only the most expert, only a reader as expert as the person who's done the analysis, could possibly hear the music the way they do. And indeed, Levinson says, even the critic doesn't really hear it that way, even if they know the piece back to front and upside down. Still, in the moment, they won't be hearing all those details. They'll be hearing what's just happened, what is happening, and what is about to happen, perhaps. Peter Kivey comes back, his opponent in this discussion, and says, on the contrary, he can't understand Levinson's position. Kivey says his greatest pleasures in listening to music, his moments of greatest absorption and responsive keenness, if you like, are precisely moments when he relates the thing he's listening to at that moment to his sense of the whole structure of the piece. He says, surely, you know, if you're listening to a work like a Beethoven symphony or a Beethoven string quartet or whatever, then the work itself is demanding that you put in the devoted sort of attention and the closeness of listener response to appreciate it in its full structural integrity. So this went on for a while, this debate, in mainly in the US Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. So it's an aesthetic debate. These are not new musicologists, but nevertheless, that reflects the kinds of dissatisfaction with existing kinds of music criticism that you find among the new musicologists. For instance, there was a debate in the Musical Times, the British Musical Times journal, between two musicologists, a guy called Jonathan Dunsby, who was really a traditional analyst. You know, he assumed that works of music at their best were complex, that they had internal structural relations, and that the job of the critic was to locate those relations, explain them, do a structural analysis, show how beautifully constructed, how closely wrought, how tightly integrated the work was. So what Dunsby did in this analysis, this essay, was to take a sequence of piano pieces by Brahms, late Brahms piano pieces, short pieces, which are separately numbered. So it looks as if they are separate pieces. all of them fairly short, not at all simple, complex pieces in themselves individually. But Dunsby says, in fact, these pieces should be heard as a sequence, as a cycle, because there are thematic connections and relationships and parallels and resemblances between the pieces. And Dunsby takes it for granted that that's a good thing. You know, it's a good thing for the composers to have managed to do this thing, to have brought it off, because it adds an extra layer of complexity and an extra layer of unity. It brings them together and makes the experience of listening to them much more unified and rewarding. That was Dunsby's assumption, and it's a very traditional assumption. Ultimately, it goes back to Schenker. It goes back to the 19th century, and it really unites the traditional community of music analysts. Now, another guy comes along, Alan Street, who is younger and who is much more trained up in the new musicology and has read Derrida and has read Paul de Man especially. And he says, why make that assumption? Why assume that making pieces hang together like that, you know, pointing out resemblances, whether discovering or inventing them? Why assume that's such a good thing? On the contrary, Street says, those resemblances are projections on Dunsby's part. They're not really there in the music, in the notes on the page. The traditional analysts appeal to the notes on the page just as traditional literary critics, close readers, appeal to the words on the page. You know, for the American new critics, this appeal, the idea that the words on the page are all we have, so we have to look at them as closely and attentively as we can. That was doctrine. That was, you know, a kind of profession of faith for them. Yeah, so Alan Street says there's nothing self-evident or sort of objectively truthful about this this conviction, this idea, organic unity. On the contrary, music is far more valuable if it explodes, or if at least it resists and pushes back against those conventional, that conventional desire for unity and integrated form. It's an idea that goes back a bit, actually. I can remember coming across it in a book it must have been in the mid-80s by an American aesthetic philosopher called Morse Peckham, and it's called Man's Rage for Chaos. And the title is a kind of twist on the idea of man's rage for order. Traditional aesthetics is a rage for order. But Peckham was quite early in getting in this protest. You know, the rage for chaos may in fact be more important, because chaos, at least a moment of chaos, is more creative. It opens up new possibilities. Now, what lies behind this new musicological revolt, if you like, is, among other things, the work of Paul de Man. Paul de Man was a deconstructionist literary critic, a member of the Yale School, an exceptionally controversial figure, partly for, well, I was going to say extraneous political reasons, but whether or not they're extraneous is really a matter of still very fierce and active debate. But I'm going to leave all that aside. It's too controversial. I don't have time to talk about it. De Man is well known, he's famous, notorious in some quarters, for his incredibly close, detailed, and sometimes scandalously heterodox readings of English poetry and philosophy, and for that matter, French and German poetry. He was quite a polymath. He was deeply suspicious of what he called aesthetic ideology. And he thought the notion of organic form was an instance of aesthetic ideology. Now, aesthetic ideology for de Man is a kind of false analogy, or a falsely literalized metaphor. And it's the metaphor that he finds, it's the metaphor that the new musicologists find in Schenker and in the conventional practice of music analysis. It's the idea that great works of whatever kind, poems or musical works, have organic form, that organic form should be demonstrated by the critic. And they argue that there's something much too self-confirming and circular about that, you know. So if you're a music analyst, let's say in America, and you've got your PhD and your postdoc, and you want to get a job, you want to get tenure, then what do? Well, you take a piece of music that's recognized as great, because then you will be getting yourself brownie points for writing about great music and appreciating its greatness. You demonstrate that it is unified and that it manages to be complex and unified at the same time. And what that does is bring a double benefit. It means the work is seen even more appreciatively as being a great work because it satisfies those criteria. And it means that you have boosted your own reputation by showing yourself sufficiently sensitive and resourceful to understand and analyze and demonstrate that unity. So the new musicologists took the view that there was something suspiciously and disablingly self-confirming about that circular process of accreditation between the work and the analyst and the institution. So they suspected there was something dodgy, something suspect going on. They took ammunition from Paul de Man because de Man spends a large number of books and essays of those claims, organic unity and so forth, but the deeply complicitous relationship between the claims made for certain kinds of poetic form and the claims made for certain kinds of national culture. De Man talks about national aestheticism as well as aesthetic ideology. And the idea is that you can see, for instance, he doesn't talk about Schenker, but if you apply it to Schenker, you can see how de Man's argument works. Schenker is saying two things. He's saying great music, organic form. That's what makes it great music. He's also saying great music, Austro-German, great tradition, great country, great nation, great culture, great language, etc. So national values, the idea of a certain national culture as giving rise organically to certain works that display the same kinds of organic unifying feature as the culture. De Man thinks that idea, that whole nexus, that whole combination, tightly connected set of ideas has had very dangerous effects. It's had real world practical political effects that if you take the German example, we ought to be aware of. Not that we, he's not saying that analysts should completely reject all the claims being made for these works of music or literature, but he's saying we should be aware of the way that that kind of metaphor, if it's extended into matters of cultural history, can do a very active bad work in acclimatizing people to nationalist cultures. So the new musicologists take this very seriously, this claim. And what someone like Alan Street is doing is pushing back against the tendency to fall back on these highly idealized and at the same time really quite retrograde organicist metaphors of growth and development and inevitable development through, whether it's through a single musical work or through a composer's life work, the idea that composers have early and developing and mature, and then sometimes late phases where they go transcendental and do strange and new things. We should regard that with a kind of salutary suspicion. So there's a kind of deep anti-nationalism going on here, and a deep suspicion of organicist metaphors. There's also a connection here with Derrida's work. De Man tends to be instanced or referred to more often by the new musicologists than Derrida, but if you look at Derrida's reading of Rousseau, especially the part of grammatology, where Derrida speaks about Rousseau and music, you find a kind of proto-new musicological analysis. Rousseau was a musician, wrote a lot about music, wrote music himself, wrote an opera, not a very successful one. But Rousseau's theory of music was basically that, like speech, music has its origin in a kind of primordial passional speech song, that the earliest music, this is very speculative on Rousseau's part, is a kind of mythical projection, really, based on, not on evidence so much as Rousseau's expressive needs. The idea that the earliest music was a kind of indistinguishable mix of language, verbal language, and speech song. Rousseau says that's the best kind of music. because it is intuitive, it's rooted in our nature, it's not artificial. He says the earliest music was melodic, it didn't have harmony, it didn't have second voices and third voices and fourth voices. It didn't have any kind of harmonic structure because it was purely expressive. It didn't need to be written down, and this is part of Rousseau's, as Derrida was the first to show, but has shown pretty conclusively, that Rousseau was very hooked on this speech versus writing binary, which Derrida finds everywhere in Western tradition, but it's especially strong in Rousseau. And that's why Rousseau is his central example in Of Grammatology. So Rousseau says, speech good, because speech is natural, heartfelt, spontaneous, undistorted by writing or by convention or by civilization, because those are all bad things for Rousseau. Just as music is primarily melodic, and he says as soon as music acquires counterpoint, second voices, complex arrangements, you have to have it written down because you can't remember it. You can remember a melody off by heart. You don't need to write it down. But as soon as you have two voices departing from each other and weaving counterpoint, then you need writing, and that corrupts music at source. So this is a kind of extended set piece demonstration of some of the points that the new musicologists are making. And Derrida shows pretty conclusively that Rousseau's thinking around a vast range of apparently unconnected topics is structured by this central binary of speech versus writing, and the melodic in music versus the harmonic, where the primary term is for Rousseau always the good term, if you like, the unmarked natural term. And the second term is the sign of degeneration or decadence or falling away from the good origin. What Derrida shows famously is that the second term, as soon as you look at the binary distinction, as soon as you look at Rousseau's argument, you find his argument contradicts itself. He demonstrates against his own intentions that the secondary term is always a condition of possibility for the first term. So the new musicologists take inspiration not only from de Man on the topic of aesthetic ideology, but also from Derrida on the nature-culture distinction, the speech-writing distinction, and above all, the melody-harmony distinction. Now, can I go on just another few minutes, Nitin? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. I think these debates in new musicology are fascinating, and I've written quite a bit about them, including the one of the pieces among the handouts. But I think they have their limits. And part of the reason for that is that post-structuralism and deconstruction are very much language focused. In fact, they're very much text focused. Derrida's readings work best with texts. You know, there are various arguments you can find in Derrida. Very often they have their parallel in other thinkers. Other thinkers have reached the same conclusions. But what's very special about Derrida is that he reaches it by textual analysis. For instance, the melody harmony thing. I mean, Derrida shows through very close reading of what Rousseau had to say about melody and harmony, that harmony is a precondition of melody. Okay, he's making the point textually. He's showing that Rousseau is unable to use that distinction without having it turn itself upside down, invert itself. And this is where his famous logic of the supplement comes in, the fact that supplement has this double sense too. Supplement, something you need to make good some existing lack, just as melody might need. So melody needs harmony to make good a lack, because otherwise melody would have no character. But the interesting thing is that Derrida's immensely detailed textual exploration and the conclusion he arrives at can be, I think, verified, or at least it can be checked against experience. You know, ask yourself, just think of a favorite tune, hum it to yourself or sing it, or just run it in your head. And the tune will carry its own harmony, even if, you know, even if you don't supply the harmony, the melody would not have the shape, the perceived shape it does, if it weren't for the implied harmony that goes along with it. So the problem for the new musicologists is that it's very difficult for them to get back from their textual analysis, which is often analysis of scores as well as words, the words that analysts have spoken about the score, to the music itself. And I think that a good counterweight, if you like, a good sort of compensatory exercise is to look at what cognitive psychologists have to say about music just recently. The big debate really among them is the debate about how far music is, well, in the jargon, in the cog-sci jargon, cognitively permeable. There's a lot of talk about 20 years ago about mental compartments, about cognitive permeability. The idea is that the mind is modular. This is the kind of thing you find in the philosopher Jerry Fodor. The mind is modular in the sense that different functions have different locations in the brain. And that to a large extent, certain modules are separate from others. The bit of our brain that does syntactic parsing, that works out the syntax, it does it independently. I couldn't speak like this if my brain wasn't doing far more work than I'm conscious of doing. If I had to think about every word I place after every other word, I wouldn't be able to say anything. I'd be completely bogged down. So Fodor generalized from that and said the most fruitful and useful and research helpful way of thinking about the mind is to think of it as being strongly modularized. But he then sort of backed away from that claim and said there was far more interconnection and interpenetration and permeability, perviousness, if you like, between the modules. And that's strong, I think, strongly borne out by music. The fact that our experience of music can't be treated as autonomous. It's informed by all sorts of things. It's informed by, for instance, what we've read about music in Derrida or in Kerman or in, I haven't mentioned Kerman so far. Well, let's say in Charles Rosen. Yeah, that's right. In other words, it's influenced by what you've heard, what you've by the commentators you've read, by the sleeve notes, by the CD notes, by what you've read in the music magazines, and by what you know of the background history, the composer biography. Musical formalists, at least the more purist among them, will say, no, that's extraneous. Just as the old new critics in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, used to say, don't read biographies of authors, poets or novelists, don't read cultural histories. The words on the page are all you have. A very, very strict and very reductive and sort of fundamentalist kind of approach. What the cognitive psychologists now seem to be telling us is that cultural history and background and being familiar with the style and knowing at least something about, let's say, a poet's friendships and influences and connections and cultural affiliations and politics and so forth is important to our experience of the poetry. And actually, I mean, a test case here is on the literary side is to go back to people, new critics like Cleanth Brooks, in his famous book, The Well-Wrought Urn, which is full of close readings that try to obey that rule. Don't go outside the text, stick to the words on the page. But he wouldn't be able to make a start on reading the poems he reads unless he knew a good bit, unless he'd done the scholarly work and the background reading. And they inform his impressions and his perceptions of the poem, even though he pretends that he's simply reading the words on the page. On the contrary, he's smuggling a lot of stuff in. And that's become evident in music criticism just recently. And that is partly informed by a movement in literary theory, the new historicism, because the new historicists have taught the new musicologists how to incorporate history and all kinds of information and ideas that a strict formalist would find inadmissible. They'd think it extraneous. On the contrary, it can be brought in without being reductive and without smuggling in all kinds of irrelevant and unhelpful external references. So there's this constant exchange, mutual interchange between literary criticism, literary theory, and of course philosophy, which I started off by talking about, which has produced a really lively dialogue, which some of you, if you have an existing interest in music, might want to follow up. So I've run a bit over time, but sorry about that. Perhaps we can have some questions now.
So thank you so much for that scholarly lecture and taking us through from structuralism to new historicism. So, Chris, we have a 10 minutes comfort break, and during the comfort break, the participants, they'll post their questions in the chat box, and we'll resume the Q&A after 10 minutes. Okay.
10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, 10
Right.
minutes. Yeah.
Righto. I'll stop my video now, shall I? Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. See you soon.